Okay. Hey, before we get into the new here, just review a couple things from yesterday. We finished up section one. We know that our government helped to get the country ready for war. We talked about the Selective Service Administration, the draft, right? So now we got soldiers, we got military, we're ready to go. And then the government turned to our industries. What did it call on industries to start making instead of consumer goods? War stuff, right? Make guns, make bullets, make tanks, make ships, make planes. And so that had an impact on our economy. Was the impact on our economy good or bad? It was good, right? It got Americans back to work, right? Pencil? Yep. It got Americans back to work. And so unemployment dropped to near zero as Americans got back to work making this stuff. Okay. And it technically essentially got us out of what was the worst economic crisis we had during the 1930s? The Great Depression, right? Gets us out of the Great Depression. And here we go. Last thing we learned about yesterday was the ways that Americans contributed here at home. Joining civil defense organizations, joining the Red Cross, organizing blackouts, rationing, right? What does rationing mean? What did Americans do during the war to ration? Right, little stamps, right? And so Americans limited the amount of stuff they used, right? And limited the amount of coffee and sugar and food they bought from stores so that all that stuff could go to the war effort, right? Limited the amount of fuel, gas they bought so that go to the war effort, okay? And Americans were called on to plant what kind of gardens in their yard? Victory gardens, right? Was that to so they could grow that food and send it off to the troops? No, so they could feed it themselves more, and the mass-produced agriculture goods could go off to the war effort. Okay, and lastly, we talked about Americans helped to pay for the war by buying these from the government. What were these things called? Liberty bonds, right? Essentially, loaning the government money to finance the war. Okay, now retaking Europe. Before we get into the invasion of the Soviet Union, let's talk about a couple things here before that, okay? So we're shifting our focus to the European theater of World War II, and we're going to cover all that here, what's going on there, okay? So what was the Atlantic Charter? The Atlantic Charter was a secret agreement between Great Britain and the United States. This was an agreement made prior to Pearl Harbor, months prior to Pearl Harbor, before we got involved in World War II. And it was a secret agreement between Great Britain, Winston Churchill, and FDR, the United States, in which we essentially said, we're on your team. We're not in this thing yet. We know we're going to. But when we do, let's agree to a couple things, a couple key principles. And I know this is different on your notes. This isn't listed on your notes there, okay? A couple key principles. Both sides agree we are not in this for territorial expansion. All right, so neither us, the United States, or you, Great Britain, are going to claim any new territory and grow. We're not going to be the new bullies that just replace Hitler and replace Japan and replace Mussolini. We are going to get rid of the problems in the world and then return the world to peace. Okay. We agreed to self-determination of nations. Self-determination means once this thing is said and done, the world gets to go back to how it was. And every country gets to decide who their new leaders are. They can have elections. They can decide what kind of economic system they have, all right? And they agreed to lasting peace after destroying the Nazis. This charter would form the basis for, see if anybody knows this is still around today. It is the world peacekeeping body of the world. It goes by its two initials usually, and the first one is U. No? I know you've heard of the UN, the United Nations, right? You hear about that in the news all the time. Okay, the United Nations is still around with us today. That is a peacekeeping organization for the world, okay, that starts after World War II and is still around with us today. It would replace the old one, world peacekeeping body that started after World War I that we never joined, the League of Nations, okay? All right, so we got this Atlantic Charter in place. Now, let's talk about the Battle of the Atlantic. This was not necessarily one specific battle like we'll learn about in the Pacific, the Battle of Iwo Jima or Okinawa or Midway. All right, this is what's going on over this entire time because we have a tough challenge. Is any of World War II going to happen here in the United States? No, none of it. All right. So we got this military now. We got these soldiers. We got all this war machines. We got to get all that stuff to where the fight is. All right. So we got to get it to the European theater. We got to get it to the Pacific, all right? And getting it across the Atlantic is going to be a very challenging thing. You guys remember, what did Germany have during World War One that they terrorized the high seas with? What? U-boats. They're going to use those again, all right? But this time even more coordinated, and they're going to threaten the shipping lanes with the use of large groups of U-boats, all working as teams called wolf packs. These things are going to devastate, be very deadly in the Atlantic, shooting down any Allied ship. To give you an idea of how deadly they were, in June of 1942 alone, these U-boats sank 175 ships in just 1 month in the Atlantic. It's a lot of ships. I think it'd be a really neat experiment. Maybe we could use AI for this, because I think that AI to detect fire, I think, is pretty cool in California. If they could do a AI thing and map out all the metal that's at the bottom of the oceans from World War II alone, just from World War II, I think it'd be incredible. You'd see specks everywhere, all right? Because literally thousands upon thousands of planes and ships in the Pacific and in the Atlantic are going to go to the bottom in World War II. Due to this, the Allies are going to develop more complex defensive strategies to combat these U-boats. Similar to World War I, we had to get our forces to Europe. Same thing in World War II, and we're going to travel in a similar manner. All right, you guys remember learning in Mr. Emerald's class traveling in convoys? What do you think it means if we're going to send everything over to Europe by convoy? We're going to send like 2-3 ships at a time? A lot, right? Like 100, all in a coordinated moving effort, and it's organized too. What kind of ships do you think you have on the outside of the convoy, and what kind of ships do you think you would have on the inside of the convoy? Right. The inside ones are going to be the vulnerable ones, right? With the troop carriers, with 2,000 troops each on them, but not heavily armed. On the outside is going to be the battleships, the destroyers, the things that's going to protect the whole group. So they're going to use these things, and we're going to have some new technologies that come out in World War II. They're going to help us with U-boat. What is it called if you're above ground and we got this technology, planes use it mainly to see if there's anything else out there. What's that called? What's it called above ground? Radar. What's it called below ground? Or excuse me, underwater. Underwater is sonar, all right? Sonar. So we developed sonar, so we're going to be able to develop this stuff and see where U-boats are without even seeing them, all right? Just by echolocation. Matter of fact, I think it's kind of funny, but if you're an animal lover, you won't think it's very funny. Guess what kind of animals, like thousands of these, were killed accidentally during World War II in the oceans because they were mistaken as submarines? Whales. All right, whales. Big, giant things look like a submarine to sonar, and so we throw out depth charges. These are bombs that go down and sink and go out, blow up at certain depths. And thinking it was a submarine, then up just comes some blubber and blood, and okay, it was a whale. All right, we're good to go. But a lot of whales get killed by that. Okay, all right. Now let's get into the invasion of the Soviet Union. All right, this is something that historians look at and say, "Boy, Hitler, you should have just been happy with Europe." All right, but he wasn't. He got greedy. All right, and as that guy said on that little trailer there's a couple temptations, really 3 big temptations that Hitler just could not pass up invading the Soviet Union. Number 1, the vast Lebensraum, the huge amount of territory for living space for his German people if he could conquer. Number 2, the vast resources that he could use for his military, oil, iron ore, all the natural resources that were there. And number 3, Soviet Union contained the largest concentration of population of these people that he wants to eradicate. Who? Jews, right? So for these reasons, Hitler is going to carry out Operation Barbarossa, starting in 1941. He is going to violate that non-aggression pact, right? Say, fingers crossed, Stalin, here I come. And he's going to launch his lightning war, Blitzkrieg, into the Soviet Union, the largest invasion by land in human history. 3 million soldiers catching Stalin completely by surprise. In the initial wave of this invasion alone, the Soviet Union is going to lose 2.5 million soldiers. trying to fight off the initial invasion. Just put that in perspective. The United States lost 407,000 total throughout the entire war. Soviet Union loses 2.5 million just in this initial invasion. Being out, who remembers why did Stalin agree to this agreement, this non-aggression agreement? What was he trying to do in his nation? Industrialize, right? To build up his military, to build up his industries. So he is going to be out weaponed, all right, out technologied here, and so not have the upper hand. So because of that, they're going to turn to a scorched earth strategy, where the Russians themselves, as they retreat into their home country, destroy everything along the way, destroy their own crops, their own livestock, their own farms, factories, their own villages, towns along the way. Why would they be doing this? Why would this make this difficult for the invading German military? Why would this make it hard for them? Yeah, Katie? Well, maybe they think they got everything and they wouldn't keep going, but they're going to keep going. What's hard about, you have a force of 3 million dudes that are invading and nothing around them is usable.
They run out of supplies.
Right. As they invade the Soviet Union, they're getting further away from where? Home, right? Germany. So as they get 100 miles in, okay, 200 miles, 300 miles, if there's nothing here to use, where do they have to get all their supplies from? Home, right? So feeding an army of 3 million people, supplying an army of 3 million people, all's got to come from hundreds of miles away. That's going to be tough logistically. Germany was poised to take Moscow and Leningrad, and I'll show you this on our animated map, all right? They get almost to the capital of the Soviet Union when Mother Nature is going to come. Winter sets in. Invading the Soviet Union during wintertime, not a good idea. Hitler thought he would have Moscow, Leningrad, and Stalingrad conquered by winter, but they were behind schedule and they didn't. And this just happened to be one of the worst winters in recent history in the Soviet Union. Due to this, thousands of Germans froze or starved to death, especially without having supplies. It's so difficult to get supplies coming all the way from home, and now winter is going to make that worse. So Germany is going to turn to a different strategy on the three major cities of the Soviet Union. They're going to place a siege first on Leningrad. It's going to last 2.5 years, so another 2 winters to come here. Anybody know what a siege is? Place a siege. This goes back to like medieval times. If you want to conquer a castle, one king wants to take over this other king's castle. He might place a siege on it rather than an all-out attack. Anybody know what that is? Kind of. You're going to slowly take it by doing nothing, but surrounding it. Or you let nothing in, you let nothing out. Eventually, what's going to happen to everybody living in that castle? Food, supplies, they're going to starve, right? So they're going to use the same philosophy here with not a castle, but cities of 5 million people. All right, surround the entire city. Don't let anything in, don't let anything out. And eventually, we're going to starve them out and they'll have no choice but to surrender. Soviets during this time were rationed 2.5 pieces of bread per day. You heard that lady talking about this, the Russian lady on America's Time the other day, where she said we were given this bread to eat, 2.5 pieces per person a day, but it wasn't even real bread. It wasn't made out of wheat. She said, I don't even know what it was made out. She had her and her husband and a baby, and she had to decide how she was going to divvy that up to get at least some of them to survive. And people were telling her, give it to your husband, let your baby die. And ended up both her husband and her baby died. All right. Leningrad citizens during this time ate almost anything that they could get any value out of. All right. There's some really crazy stories coming out of Leningrad and Stalingrad during this time. The people would take the wallpaper off of their houses and off the walls in their house and boil it in water, because the wallpaper glue was made out of potatoes. So they were essentially eating the glue because it had some little bits of potatoes in it. and drinking the water and eating the glue and trying to eat the wallpaper itself. Anything that was made out of leather, all right, this leather belt right here, they would boil and drink the water and try to get it soft enough to be able to chew and digest. Leather shoes, briefcases. You imagine trying to chew up a leather shoe? It'd be horrible. Matter of fact, there are many, many stories of people being in very, very dire situations and turning to eating what? People. Cannibalism. There's a lot of cannibalism. That was actually an underground black market of human meat to survive during these sieges. During this time, 1 million people in Leningrad died during the siege. You have people dying of starvation around you. It's the wintertime. Their bodies are frozen. We could die ourselves, or we could use the meat to survive a couple more days. Crazy to have to think about what people would go through to survive. During this time, Stalin asked Churchill, we start to see a rift here between our ally now, the Soviet Union, and our other ally, Great Britain, because Stalin is asking Churchill and us for a Western front. He's like, come on, I'm fighting this thing all on my own. You need to open a Western front, get D-Day going, and we're going to wait 2.5 years before we get D-Day going. At the Battle of Stalingrad, another major Soviet city, the Germans circled the city, then Russians encircled the Germans, and winter set in again. This turned to deadly street fighting in the cities of Stalingrad. Once again, people trying to survive, massive starvation. But in the end, Germany is forced to surrender at Stalingrad, losing 330,000 casualties. Stalingrad was a turning point in the war. Germany would not take the Soviet Union, and Germany would then turn and retreat in a slow retreat on a long march home where thousands more Germans would die on the march home because there was nothing to survive upon. Soviet Union then turned on the advance and goes on the attack with the goal of unconditional surrender and the eventual capture of Berlin, the capital city of Germany. So the Soviet Union is now on the march from the east, fighting in the east, dwarfed fighting in the west. All right, meaning fighting in the east was on so much more of a grand scale. It's hard to comprehend. The Soviet Union alone lost 18 million people. United States, 407,000. Soviet Union, 18 million. And we're going to see that's why the Soviet Union is going to use uncommon brutality when they do get to Berlin to repay the German population for what was done to them in the invasion of the Soviet Union. Okay, we'll stop right there with notes. I want to show you this